Army of the Dead Unholy Death Knight build is one of the strongest ways to play in the current midnight pre-patch season. Not because of its sudden burst damage, but because of how much presence it brings to the battlefield. With incredibly strong and almost endlessly summoned Magus of the Dead, ghouls, and even the Four Horsemen, the area around you rarely feels empty. This build leans fully into the summoner fantasy, not by overwhelming you with complexity, but by letting your army do the work naturally. Following Blizzard's newer design direction in Midnight, the gameplay stays approachable with clear priorities and very little mechanical overload. From humble ghouls and skeleton soldiers to the ever-present Magus of the Dead, you step onto the battlefield not alone, but as a commander leading an army forward. This build is especially recommended for players who enjoy playing with summons and watching their army grow over time. If you like overwhelming your opponents, not with single abilities, but through sheer numbers of constant pressure, this playstyle will feel very natural. It's also a great fit for anyone drawn to the necromancer fantasy, commanding undead forces and controlling the flow of battle from the front line. To get started, you can choose races like Orc. Orcs are a strong choice for PvP thanks to hardiness, which provides built-in resistance to stuns. They also gain access to Blood Fury, a powerful racial cooldown that functions almost like a free offensive PvP trinket. On top of that, Orcs have access to racials like Command, which directly increase your minions' damage, a perfect match for Unholy Death Knight build that revolves around constant summoning. And of course, from a class fantasy and lore perspective, an Orc leading an army of undead fits the theme exceptionally well. Another race worth considering is the Moghar Orc. This is actually the race I'm using for the build showcased today. Among their racials, bonuses like increased mount speed or reduced duration of poisons, diseases, and curses don't make a significant impact for this setup. Even Sympathetic Vigor, which increases pet health, doesn't end up being very noticeable in practice. That said, Ancestral Call is an excellent racial ability. It temporarily increases one of your two highest secondary stats, making it especially effective during burst windows. If you're looking to amplify your damage at key moments, Moghar Orc remains a solid and viable alternative. Somewhat surprisingly, Undead isn't the race I strongly recommend for this build. The main reason is that the Will of Forsaken overlaps to some extent with the Death Knight's own ability, the Lichborn, which already provides similar utility in many situations. Because of that overlap, the racial doesn't add that much value, as it might on other classes. That said, if you are fully committed to walking the darker path and embracing the essence of evil itself, playing an Undead Death Knight is still a perfectly valid and undeniably lore appropriate choice. So far, we focus mostly on Horde races, but there are plenty of strong alternatives on the Alliance side as well. A classic and very fitting option is Human, the race of Arthas, one of the most iconic Death Knights in Warcraft history. Humans gain access to the human spirit, which provides a solid bonus to secondary stats, and scales well with most PvP setups. More importantly, Will to Survive allows you to replace your PvP trinket with an additional damage trinket, giving you more flexibility in your gear choices. On top of that, humans pair exceptionally well with the Death Knight's plate armor, making them a strong fit not only mechanically, but also from a class fantasy and lore perspective. Next, let's take a look at stat priority. The one you want to focus on the most for this build is Mastery. Mastery is an extremely efficient stat for Unholy Death Knight, especially for this build. Because it provides multiple benefits at once, it increases your minion's damage, boosts your shadow damage abilities, and even enhances the critical strike damage of your minions. Because how much value it offers, I've chosen to invest heavily into Mastery over the other secondary stats. Almost all of the Unholy Death Knight's damage, with the exception of Festering Strike, is shadow based. Your minions also deal shadow damage, which means Mastery scales nearly with every source of damage this build relies on. Your plagues, such as Dread Plague or Virulent Plague, are shadow damage. Scourge Strike deals shadow damage, Putrefy is shadow based as well, and even the Death Coil falls under shadow damage. Because so much of your damage profile shares the same damage type, Mastery consistently outperforms other secondary stats in terms of overall value for this build. Haste is of course still a useful stat. It increases attack speed and casting speed, including for your minions. However, since most Unholy minions are not permanent summons and only remain active for a limited time, I found it more effective to focus on increasing their overall damage output rather than their speed. For this build, prioritizing Mastery provides more consistent and reliable damage across the entire fight. Since this is the midnight pre-patch season, gearing for this build is relatively straightforward. For PvP gear, you will want to prioritize pieces that provide mastery. This includes slots like your helm, shoulders, chest, wrist, and weapon. In slots where mastery focused PvP gear isn't available from vendors, or if you want more control over your stat distribution, crafted gear is a solid alternative. And because we are currently in the pre-patch period, material prices have dropped significantly, making this a great time to experiment with crafting without a heavy gold investment. If you're short on Conquest points, one of the most efficient ways to farm them right now is through crate farming. With this method, you can earn roughly 600 to 800 Conquest per hour without much difficulty. To get started, download the Hated Tracker add-on, then browse the pre-made group list, and join any group that's actively running crate routes. Even if you're not fully familiar with the process, simply follow the group around the map and stay with the pack. Crates spawn in different zones on a roughly 15-minute timer, and as long as you're present and participating, you will receive the rewards. This method is very beginner friendly and doesn't require strong PvP performance to be effective. More importantly, it's very likely that crate farming will remain unchanged going into midnight, making it a reliable Conquest farming strategy even in the new expansion. For your cloak, you can purchase the racial wraps in Karash and socket it with crafted pure energizing fiber. It's a simple upgrade, but an efficient way to further reinforce your stat priorities for this build. If you have followed along up to this point, your mastery should be sitting at around 70%. In PvP situations, that number can climb to nearly 90%. At that level, your minions and shadow damage are increased by roughly 90%, and your minions' critical strike damage is boosted by about 30%. For most races, this is where the setup would end. However, if you're playing a Maghar Orc, you can push things even further by using Ancestral Call. When activated, Ancestral Call temporarily boosts one of your highest secondary stats, in this case, Mastery, raising it to nearly 97%. At that level, both your minions and shadow damage receive a 97% increase, allowing you to deliver a noticeably stronger burst window. With those numbers in place, your army is no longer just supporting you. That is the point where you are fully prepared to unleash the army of the dead and let the build do what it's designed to do. When it comes to talents, the goal is simple. Summon as many minions as possible and make each of them hit as hard as possible. This build fully commits to empowering your army, rather than splitting power into utility or personal bursts. For your hero talent choice, you will want to take the Rider of the Apocalypse. This allows you to summon Morgraine, Whitemane, Trollbane, and Nazgrim, binding these legendary heroes to your service. Each of the 4 horsemen brings their own unique abilities, such as Death and Decay and Chains of Ice, helping you control space and pressure enemies across the battlefield. By default, the 4 horsemen are summoned randomly during combat. However, with Ride or Die talent, you can significantly reduce that randomness. When paired with Dark Transformation, this talent ensures that Whitemane is always summoned, giving you reliable and consistent value during important moments. Unholy Armaments further strengthens this setup by increasing the damage of all horsemen by 5%, making every summon more impactful and reinforcing the core strength of the build. Next, the Fury of the Horsemen extends the duration of Horseman's Aid by up to 5 additional seconds, allowing their presence and pressure to last even longer. Finally, the capstone talent Apocalypse Now ties everything together. With this talent, casting Army of the Dead summons all 4 horsemen at once. Considering that Army of the Dead has a cooldown of only a minute and a half, this turns out into an extremely powerful and surprisingly frequent cooldown. Let's go through the Unholy talent tree, starting from the top. In general, the right side of the tree focuses on minion empowerment, while the left side revolves around disease-based talents. For clarity, I will break the key talents down into 3 main categories: the core spell, the Putrefy, minion empowerment talents, and additional minion summoning talents. At the center of this entire setup is one key ability, Putrefy. As mentioned earlier, Putrefy deals shadow damage and summons a lesser ghoul. This ability is the backbone of the build. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that nearly every talent choice and rotation decision is made with a single goal in mind: casting Putrefy more often and making it as strong as possible. Putrefy also synergies directly with Unholy Devotion, which further empowers your permanent ghoul by increasing their attack speed by 25%. With the Harbinger of Doom, every time you cast Scourge Strike, the cooldown of Putrefy is reduced by 2.5 seconds, allowing you to use it far more frequently. Putrid Echoes takes this even further by increasing Putrefy's damage by 20% and granting 1 additional charge. When combined with the PvP talent, Necrotic Wounds, Putrefy can stack up to 3 charges, turning it into a constant and repeatable source of pressure. Next is talents that empowers minions. You want to select Dark Transformation because it turns your fragile ghoul into a massive, hard-hitting monster. With Ghoulish Frenzy, casting Dark Transformation also increases the attack speed and damage of your all minions by 5%. Grave Mastery further strengthens your army by increasing your minions' critical strike damage by 15%. Finally, Commander of the Dead and Outnumber massively enhance your army, providing up to a 50% increase to your minions and overall effectiveness. So far, we've looked into making our minions stronger. Now it's time to summon more of them. To further increase the number of active summons, Magus of the Dead brings a skeleton spellcaster onto the battlefield. Necromancer's Cunning allows Putrefy to summon an additional lesser ghoul. Reanimation adds another layer of pressure by summoning an extra Magus of the Dead and increasing its spell damage by 25%. You also want to take the Doomed Beating talent. Each cast of Deathcoil summons yet another lesser ghoul, ensuring your army continues to grow even while you're spending runic power. And there's more to minions. All Will Serve grants an additional skeletal archer. As mentioned earlier, this minion deals shadow damage, making it scale extremely well with mastery. Raise Abomination adds yet another layer of power. When you cast Army of the Dead, an Abomination is summoned and enemies take 10% increased damage from your minions. Finally, summoning more lesser ghouls creates strong synergy with the PvP talent Stitch Master. Whenever a lesser ghoul dies, you gather its remains and heal for 50% of its maximum health, turning fallen minions into a reliable source of sustain in PvP. As for the playstyle, remember that the primary goal of this build is to cast Putrefy as often as possible, and continuously raise new minions. The majority of your damage will be generated through Putrefy, so everything you do should support using it more frequently and more efficiently. Your basic rotation starts with Outbreak to apply your plagues. Next, use Festering Strike to build stacks that allow your next Scourge Strike to summon a lesser ghoul. Whenever possible, try to use Scourge Strike only when those stacks are available, so you don't waste potential summons. After that, the flow becomes very straightforward. When you have runes available, spend them on Putrefy to continue summon minions. When you are low on runes, dump your runic power with Deathcoil to trigger runic corruption, which helps your runes regenerate faster. If sudden doom procs at any point, always consume it immediately with Deathcoil. One of the strengths of this build is its flexibility between melee and ranged combat. Out of all your core abilities, Festering Strike is the only one that requires melee range. Everything else, including Putrefy, Deathcoil, and your damage over time effects, have a 30-yard range. This means that once you step in to apply Festering Strike stacks, you can safely reposition and continue applying pressure from range while your minions do the rest of the work. This flexibility becomes especially valuable in PvP. As a melee class, constantly chasing kiting enemies at range can be incredibly frustrating. With this build, you don't have to fully commit to that chase. When enemies are close, you can pressure them in melee without hesitation. and when they create distance, you can continue applying meaningful pressure from range without losing momentum or damage. This ability to respond smoothly, whether the fight happens up close or at a distance, is one of the build's biggest strengths in PvP. All it really requires is committing to melee briefly to build your festering strike stacks. Once that condition is met, you are free to control the fight from range, harassing your opponents with magic and an army of summons. At that point, you're no longer just a melee fighter, but a true spellblade, toying with your enemies through spells and summoned forces. This advantage isn't limited to PvP, it's also extremely valuable in PvE. There are plenty of encounters where bosses force melee players to disengage or stay at range for extended periods. In those situations, while other classes are left waiting with very little to do, this build can immediately shift into ranged pressure. Without changing your setup or rotation, you can continue dealing meaningful damage from range until it's safe to re-engage. That kind of flexibility makes the build feel consistently effective, even in encounters that traditionally punish melee players. When you are under pressure or need a sudden spike of power, the response is very straightforward. Activate Dark Transformation, follow it up with the Army of the Dead, and focus primarily on casting Putrefy. While doing so, freely weave in Scourge Strike and Death Coil to keep the pressure constant. At that point, your minions take care of the rest. They apply debuffs, handle area damage, and as lesser goals fall, they even help sustain you by restoring health. Everything comes together, damage, control, and survivability, into a complete package. And the best part is that this entire sequence is available every a minute and a half thanks to the cooldown of the Army of the Dead. This build also works well for players who enjoy using both melee and ranged tools, blending spellcasting and weapon combat into a single, flexible playstyle. And finally, this build is ideal for players who prefer to hold the front line on the battleground, creating space and stability so allied casters and healers can operate safely behind them. This build may not be the best fit for players who enjoy silently infiltrating the enemy backline and operating completely on their own. If you prefer a clean solo playstyle where you cut through enemies without relying on minions or summoned units, this build will likely feel cluttered. And finally, if you are the type of player who strictly sides with justice and refuses to draw power from the darker forces, the Unholy Death Knight fantasy might simply not be for you. This minion-focused Unholy Death Knight build performs solidly in both PvE and PvP. While Death Knights are already known for excelling in solo content like Delves, this build takes the strength further and distributing responsibility across your army. Instead of shouldering everything on your own, you let your minions absorb pressure, apply control, and contribute damage, allowing you to adapt smoothly to almost any situation. At the same time, the build stays true to the class fantasy and lore of the Death Knight. And on the battlefield, it gives you a clear answer to enemies who try to gain an advantage by keeping you at range. If you enjoy commanding an army and turning that pressure back on your opponents, this build offers a lot of depth and a lot of fun. If you like to see builds for other classes or different playstyle concepts, feel free to leave a comment below.